I found it in a newspaper from January 1899, buried in archives most people don't access anymore, documented by people who had no reason to fabricate. The Middletown Signal, January 17, 1899, a regional Ohio newspaper, reporting something that should have made headlines across America if anyone had understood what it meant. Bones of prehistoric giant found near Miamisburg. Not alleged giant, not possible giant, not giant-like, just giant, stated as observable fact, measured by workers, examined by professionals, authenticated by the Smithsonian Institution itself. And then the article delivered details that made everything stop when I first read them. The body of a man more gigantic than any ever recorded in human history has been found in the Miami Valley in Ohio. The skeleton, it is calculated, must have belonged to a man 8 feet 1.5 inches in height. 8 feet 1.5 inches. Not a rough estimate, not an approximation, a calculated height based on skeletal measurements, and this wasn't some frontier newspaper, prone to exaggeration. This was 1899, the age of systematic archaeology, scientific measurement, institutional oversight. 2 men found it, Edward Gebhardt and Edward Kaufman, working in a gravel pit near Miamisburg. Not archaeologists, not scientists, just laborers extracting materials for road construction, breaking through layers of earth that had remained undisturbed for centuries, possibly millennia. And they struck bone, massive bone, articulated in a way that made it clear they were looking at a complete human skeleton, buried at a depth suggesting immense antiquity, preserved in conditions that had kept the remains intact across time spans we can barely comprehend. The bones were carefully extracted, measured, documented, and then, because this was 1899 and such discoveries were considered newsworthy rather than controversial, they were placed on public exhibition. The Middletown Signal reported that many are the curious sightseers who have passed in. Wonder before them, people came from across the region, they saw, they marveled at skeletal remains of impossible scale. And then the scientific establishment arrived. Professor Thomas Wilson, curator of prehistoric anthropology at the Smithsonian Institution, examined the skull personally, and what he said next should have triggered a fundamental reassessment of North American prehistory. The authenticity of the skull is beyond any doubt. Not possibly authentic, not interesting if true. Beyond any doubt, a Smithsonian curator examining physical evidence, declaring without qualification that this skull was genuine. Wilson continued, its antiquity unquestionably great. To my own personal knowledge, several such crania were discovered in the Hopewell group of mounds in Ohio. To my own personal knowledge, meaning this wasn't secondhand information, this wasn't speculation, this was a Smithsonian curator admitting on record that he had personally seen multiple giant skulls excavated from Ohio mounds, not one, several, not from a single location, from multiple sites across the Hopewell mound complex. Wilson provided anatomical details that authenticated what Gebhardt and Kaufman had found. The jaws were prognathous, projecting beyond the face, and the facial index remarkably low. Technical observations, the kind of precise descriptions that only come from direct examination of skeletal remains. But to understand why this matters, you have to understand Miamisburg Mound itself. Rising from the landscape outside Miamisburg is one of the most impressive prehistoric structures in North America, a massive conical burial mound dominating the terrain for miles. 65 feet tall, originally more than 70 feet before excavations lowered its peak, with a base circumference of 867 feet, containing approximately 54,000 cubic yards of earth, all moved by hand, all shaped without metal tools, all constructed with precision, suggesting sophisticated engineering knowledge. The largest conical burial mound in Ohio, possibly the largest in the entire eastern United States, built by the Adena culture sometime between 800 BCs and 100 AD. The skeleton wasn't found inside the mound. It was discovered half a mile away, in that gravel pit where Gebhardt and Kaufman were doing commercial excavation. But the proximity isn't coincidental. The mound marks the center of what was clearly an important prehistoric site, and the surrounding area contains burial grounds, artifact deposits, evidence of long-term habitation by people who left their mark on the landscape in ways we're still discovering. In 1869, 30 years before the Gebhardt and Kaufman discovery, an archaeological expedition excavated portions of Miamisburg mound itself. At 8 feet below the summit, they found a burial, a bark-covered tomb containing human remains, and at 36 feet below the surface, they found another burial vault, suggesting multiple levels of interment, a layered construction implying the mound was built in stages, with burials added over generations. The excavators discovered something peculiar, a layer of flat stones at 24 feet depth, overlapping like shingles on a roof, suggesting that at some point in its history, the mound may have had a stone facing. And throughout the region surrounding Miamisburg Mound, skeletal remains kept appearing, and they kept being larger than expected. when Professor Wilson examined the 1899 skull and confirmed its authenticity, when he noted that he had personally seen similar crania from the Hopewell group of mounds, he was acknowledging a pattern that appeared throughout Ohio archaeology. The 12th annual report of the Bureau of Ethnology, published by the Smithsonian Institution itself, documents multiple discoveries of oversized skeletons in Ohio mounds. Near the original surface of the mound, lying at full length upon its back, was one of the largest skeletons discovered by the Bureau agents, the length as proved by actual measurement being between 7 and 8 feet. Not estimation, measurement, skeletons physically measured by trained personnel using standardized techniques. In the center of Mound 11, 3 feet below the surface, was a vault 8 feet long and 3 feet wide. In the bottom of this lay a skeleton fully 7 feet long. The length from the base of the skull to the bones of the toes was found to be 7 feet 3 inches. It is probable, therefore, that this individual when living was 7.5 feet high. At the Dover Mound, excavators encountered a burial measuring 84 inches from skull to foot, 7 feet exactly, with bone structure suggesting a robust, powerfully built individual. In the Great Smith Mound at Charleston, West Virginia, P.W. Norris of the Smithsonian discovered an elaborate timber burial chamber, 13 feet long and 12 feet wide, reaching 9 feet high with a sloping roof. And inside that chamber, 19 feet from the top, he measured a skeleton 7 feet 6 inches in length with shoulders spanning 19 inches. At the Cresap Mound in West Virginia, excavators in 1959 found burial 54 at the lowest strata, described in the official report as an individual of large proportions. When measured in the tomb, his length was approximately 7.04 feet. All the long bones were heavy and possessed marked eminences for the attachment of muscles. These aren't newspaper accounts, subject to exaggeration. These are official Smithsonian reports, written by their own field agents, describing what they measured during systematic scientific excavations, documented in government publications that still exist in archives today. So, when Edward Gebhardt and Edward Kaufman uncovered an 8-foot 1.5-inch skeleton in that gravel pit, when Professor Thomas Wilson examined it and declared its authenticity beyond doubt, they weren't reporting something unprecedented. They were adding one more data point to an already established pattern that the Smithsonian's own records confirmed. But here's what makes the 1899 Miamisburg discovery particularly significant. Unlike many giant skeleton reports that disappeared into private collections or were lost to time, this one was publicly exhibited, examined by a credible authority, documented in a newspaper with specific measurements, tied to a specific location that can still be visited today. The gravel pit where it was found was within half a mile of Miamisburg Mound, which still stands. You can drive to Miamisburg right now, walk up the 116 steps to the summit, stand at the exact location where ancient people constructed one of the most impressive earthworks in North America. And somewhere within half a mile of that spot, probably buried under modern development, is the exact location where workers uncovered skeletal remains measuring over 8 feet tall. The physical geography hasn't changed, the mound is still there, the Miami River Valley still stretches out below the ridge, the landscape that witnessed the construction of these monuments and the burial of these individuals remains. What's missing is the skeleton itself. After Professor Wilson examined the bones, after they were placed on public exhibition, after the newspaper reported the discovery to readers across the Miami Valley, the skeleton vanished from the historical record. No follow-up articles, no museum accession records, no photographs, no casts, no further scientific examination. Just silence. The Smithsonian Institution, which had actively collected skeletal remains from Ohio mounds throughout the 1880s and 1890s, which maintained extensive collections of burial artifacts, which employed Professor Thomas Wilson specifically to examine and document such discoveries, somehow has no record of the Miamisburg giant in its current collections. And this pattern of institutional collection followed by institutional silence repeats across dozens of similar discoveries. Throughout the 1800s, across the Midwest, newspaper accounts regularly describe discoveries of giant skeletons, not as sensational anomalies, but as relatively routine archaeological finds. Wisconsin, 1891, investigators reported finding enormous burial mounds containing skeletons of unusual size. The remains were sent to Washington. They were never displayed, never studied publicly, never mentioned in any publications. Ohio, throughout the 1800s, dozens of newspaper accounts described the opening of ancient mounds, revealing skeletons measuring 7 to 9 feet in length. Some included detailed descriptions of artifacts, copper ornaments, sophisticated burial practices. The Portsmouth News Herald, January 3, 1895, reported that bridge carpenters on the N&W Railroad found a skeleton measuring 7 feet 4 inches while excavating 3 miles east of town. In May 1897, the Daily Public Ledger documented Dr. Clarence Loveberry curator of the Ohio State University Museum, discovering 10 skeletons in 2 mounds on the Briggs Farm near Chillicothe. One measured 8 feet tall. Near Toledo, the Chicago Record reported in October 1895 that excavators uncovered 20 skeletons, seated and facing east, with jaws and teeth twice as large as those of present-day people. Beside each skeleton was a large bowl with curiously wrought hieroglyphic figures. Most of these finds disappeared within months of discovery. Kentucky, Tennessee, Pennsylvania. The pattern repeats: local discoveries, brief newspaper mentions, then silence, the remains vanish, the mounds are destroyed by farming or development, the evidence disappears before systematic study can be conducted. The conventional explanation: measurement errors, misidentified mastodon bones, exaggerations by untrained observers, but that explanation doesn't account for the professional archaeologists who documented these finds. It doesn't explain the detailed measurements published in official Smithsonian reports. And it certainly doesn't address Professor Thomas Wilson's unequivocal statement that the Miamisburg skull's authenticity was beyond any doubt. Wilson wasn't a frontier farmer prone to exaggeration. He was the curator of prehistoric anthropology at the Smithsonian Institution, a trained scientist whose professional reputation depended on accurate assessment of archaeological evidence. And he went on record stating that he had personally seen multiple similar skulls from Ohio mounds. So what happened to them? Where are the several such crania Wilson mentioned from the Hopewell group? Where are the 7 to 8 foot skeletons documented in the Bureau of Ethnology's 12th annual report? Where is the 8 foot 1.5 inch skeleton that Edward Gebhardt and Edward Kaufman pulled from that gravel pit in 1899? The Smithsonian claims they don't have them, claims they never had them, claims these discoveries either never happened or were misidentifications. But the newspaper archives tell a different story, the 19th century scientific reports tell a different story, and Professor Thomas Wilson's own words, preserved in the Middletown Signal, tell a very different story. Miamisburg Mound still stands. You can visit it today, climb those 116 steps to the observation platform at the top, look out across the Miami Valley, the same valley where the Adena culture thrived over 2,000 years ago. The mound is managed by the Ohio History Connection, preserved as a state memorial, protected from commercial development, and tourists come, they climb to the top, they take photographs, they read informational plaques explaining the Adena culture in simplified terms. But nowhere on those plaques will you find mention of the 8 foot 1.5 inch skeleton discovered half a mile away. Nowhere will you read about Professor Thomas Wilson's examination and authentication. Nowhere will you learn that the Smithsonian's own reports document multiple oversized skeletons from Ohio mounds. That part of the story has been quietly edited out. The Middletown Signal article from January 17, 1899 still exists. You can find it in historical archives. You can read the measurements. You can see Professor Wilson's name. You can verify that this discovery was real, was documented, was examined by qualified experts who confirmed its authenticity. And that creates an uncomfortable question. If this skeleton was authentic, if Wilson's examination was legitimate, if the measurements were accurate, then what does that mean about the history we've been taught? It means that in 1899, in the Miami Valley of Ohio, 2 workers found physical evidence of a human population substantially larger than any known modern ethnic group. Evidence that suggested these individuals weren't medical anomalies, but part of a distinct population. Evidence authenticated by the scientific establishment before mysteriously disappearing from the historical record. It means that the Adena culture, the Hopewell culture, and possibly other prehistoric populations of the Ohio Valley included individuals of exceptional size. Individuals who were considered important enough to be buried beneath massive earthen monuments requiring incredible labor to construct. It means that throughout the 1800s, as America expanded westward, as construction workers and archaeologists broke ground across the Midwest, they kept finding these bones, kept reporting them, kept sending them to institutions that claimed to want scientific truth. And it means that somewhere between the moment of discovery and the present day, someone made a decision that this evidence was better off lost than preserved. The Miamisburg skeleton isn't alone. It's part of a pattern that extends across the continent, a pattern of discovery, documentation, institutional collection, and disappearance, a pattern so consistent it can't be explained by accident or coincidence. Professor Thomas Wilson examined that skull in 1899 and declared its authenticity beyond doubt. He noted that he had seen similar skulls from other Ohio mounds. He documented the unusual facial structure and jaw projection. And then, at some point between that examination and today, that skull disappeared. Edward Gebhardt and Edward Kaufman found an 8 foot 1.5 inch skeleton in an Ohio gravel pit. Hundreds of people saw it on public exhibition. A newspaper documented it with specific measurements, and then it vanished as if it had never existed. The 12th annual report of the Bureau of Ethnology documented multiple 7 to 8 foot skeletons from systematically excavated Ohio mounds, and today the Smithsonian claims no such skeletons exist in their collections. This isn't conspiracy theory, this is pattern recognition. This is looking at documented evidence and asking why there's such a profound disconnect between what 19th century scientists reported finding and what 21st century institutions claim exists. Miamisburg Mound still rises 65 feet above the Miami Valley, still dominates the landscape, still marks the center of what was clearly an important prehistoric site. The Adena people who built it are gone, their language is lost, their beliefs are unknown, but their monument remains, testament to a culture with capabilities we're only beginning to understand. And half a mile away, beneath the modern city, beneath streets and buildings and parking lots, there may be more burials, more evidence, more skeletons that could answer the questions the 1899 discovery raised. But we'll never know. Because the first skeleton, the one that was documented and examined and authenticated, the one that could have led to systematic investigation of the surrounding area, that skeleton is gone. And with it went the opportunity to understand something fundamental about who lived in North America before recorded history. The Middletown Signal article from January 17, 1899, represents a moment when the truth was briefly visible, when evidence emerged that challenged conventional narratives, when a Smithsonian curator went on record confirming something that shouldn't exist according to established frameworks. And then that moment passed. The skeleton disappeared, the story was forgotten, and history moved on as if nothing had happened. But the newspaper still exists, the words are still there, the measurements are still recorded, Professor Thomas Wilson's authentication is still preserved in archives. And anyone willing to look can verify that in 1899, in Miamisburg, Ohio, 2 workers found something that shouldn't exist, something real enough to be examined by the Smithsonian's curator of prehistoric anthropology, something authentic enough to be displayed for public viewing. Something that's now gone, erased from the record, lost to history, leaving us with nothing but a century-old newspaper article and the uncomfortable question of why the evidence keeps disappearing.